Another beautiful episode of Healthy Living, reaching you from the nation's capital, Abuja. I am Olamide Alhassan, your guide through today's program. Now, today we'll look at a critical issue that affects students, educators, and communities alike: mental health in education. Now, with increasing awareness about the importance of mental health, it's essential to ensure wellness for all, especially within our educational systems. The pressures of academic performance, social dynamics, and personal growth are immense, making mental well-being a cornerstone of a thriving educational environment. Today, we're privileged to have two distinguished experts in the field with us to explore this topic in depth. Now we have Dr. Janeé Avent Harris, an assistant dean at East Carolina University. She brings her extensive experience in counseling and her focus on spirituality, belonging, and wellness in higher education. And joining her is Dr. Loni Crumb, a seasoned professional in mental and environmental health services with over 15 years of experience, particularly in rural areas where she has worked tirelessly to improve access to mental health care and education. Today, our discussion will cover the challenges, strategies in promoting mental health in schools and universities, the impact of rural settings on mental health services, and innovative approaches to creating supportive and inclusive education environments. It promises to be totally worth your while. So let's dive into this crucial conversation and understand how we can better support mental health in education for everyone involved. Stick around. You're welcome to the studio once again, Dr. Harris.
Thank you.
And you're welcome, Dr. Crumb.
Thank you for having me.
How are you both doing today?
Doing well, thank you.
Amazing.
You look great.
Thank you.
You look angelic, so let's do
thank
that. And you look really, really marvelous.
Thank you.
And good to have you in the studio. Welcome to Healthy Living.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start with you, Dr. Harris. Could you please take us through your background? How did you get to mix spirituality with mental health? I'm wondering.
Sure. So my background, I have a master's in clinical mental health counseling, and then I went for my PhD in counseling and counselor education. And I grew up in a, I would say, fairly small town, and church was a huge part of what we did. It was like who we were. It was kind of a central location for a lot of our resources. And so when I became a counselor, I understood how people can have several support systems for their coping. And so I wanted to invite that into the counseling room, and I also wanted to be able to train pastors and leaders, faith leaders, on how they can also promote mental wellness. So it was a combination of those things.
I'm beginning to wonder, though it's really interesting to hear that, but were there no challenges that you had to go through, especially inculcating these things? Because most of the time in the religious faith, they look at it and tell you, you do not have a mental health challenge, especially when it's religion. You know, that's why I had to ask you, how did you get to mix these things together?
It's a process.
Okay.
And so there was, and still is, to some extent, a lot of stigma and a lot of minimizing, I think, saying, oh, just pray about it, or it's okay, or you got to have faith. But I think the more we're able to provide education and talk with faith leaders, and a lot of my work is centered around faith leaders because they hold a lot of power and influence, right? And so when they are on board, first with their own mental health and thinking about how they get their own care, but also promoting that in their congregations, it really is helpful. But there have been some challenges of like, and I always say on the other side of things, counseling hasn't always been a safe space for people to bring their faith into the room. And so it took a lot of training for counselors as well to say, this is how you hold space for people, for their spirituality, for their religion, and how we merge those two things. They are not separate, because when people walk in a room, in a counseling space, or in a school, wherever, they bring their whole self. You don't just leave one part of yourself outside. You bring your whole self. And so we as therapists, as educators, have to be prepared to respond to that.
I can imagine that's a whole lot of work, especially when it comes to handling those challenges. So Dr. Crumb, let's peep into your background. You've had 15 years of experience in behavioral health. So how has it been so far, especially in rural communities?
Well, in rural communities, they look a little different. And anytime I speak about how my work, I have to think about where I started, right? I don't can never say where I am or where I'm going unless I share a bit about where I started. Exactly. I, like Janeé, we are from rural North Carolina. And when I was a very small young child, one of my best friends got gang raped by a group of boys. And this was a child who came out to play all the time. We were riding bikes. And next thing you know, he he sort of disappears and he becomes a recluse in his house. He stopped coming to school as he should, and he definitely didn't get any mental health support because there was no mental health provider. Also, the community was so ashamed because we also know the other people who are the perpetrators of it. And so every day I remember, even up until now, I look at him and he just didn't come out the house anymore. He didn't engage anymore. And I always thought, man, there's got to be some way to help him.
Exactly.
And why aren't we talking about this? Everybody knew what happened, but the families didn't want to talk about it. That's that stigma and that shame. And the young man to this day has a lot of troubles, had a lot of troubles. But what if he would have gotten the help? The adequate help back then. And so my life work was to respond to rural areas, to rural concerns. Number one, to the victims or to those who things happen to, so they have somebody to talk to. Maybe it will never be like person per person, but at least one representative, one professional representative. And also to the families to work past this shame and stigma and know that hiding it is not helping it.
Exactly.
Right? Like the covering up is not helping it. Let's really work through these issues because it can last a lifetime. And even though we may not make it
like
go
life
away.
wasting away in the process.
Yeah. And so that brings me to my work current day, being a mental health provider and working particularly in rural areas and informing people about mental health issues, signs, concerns, and what we refer to as mental health literacy, as well as helping people get mental health professional training. So I'm associate professor of counselor education at East Carolina University. And a great part of my job is helping people to get counseling degrees and so they can go out in the world, but particularly to practice in rural areas.
It's actually very unbelievable, viewers. Would you believe that these people have had a lot of experience and yet looking so young, like they've never been anywhere? But okay, let's quickly peek into probably some of the challenges you've had, in the process working in the rural areas. What challenges did you experience? Because most of the time, it's important to probably look at some of the things, the issues that you discovered, and that way we're able to now begin to navigate through them and prefer solutions. So what kind of challenges did you experience in your field in those rural areas?
Well, a lot of the work recently that I've been doing is school-based mental health and going back to rurality because there aren't a lot of clinics and mental health professionals. The school gets everything. The school gets all of the children issues and then they get all of the adult issues because there aren't adult providers as well. So one thing to know about rurality is that a lot of the work, there's a lot of opportunity there through the schools. And usually we have fewer schools, so everybody is coming to one place. So I like to take my services into the schools. And so really we get to see everything. We get to see food insecurity. We get to see housing insecurity. We get to see some more severe cases, PTSD a lot. We get to see familiar challenges because we have a lot of kindergarten through 12th grade schools. So we get to see the family challenges. Incarceration, everything comes to the school because children tell teachers everything.
Wow.
And so really we get to see just the whole conglomerate of mental health concerns, issues, or situations that may cause mental stress.
Talking about mental health for most of the time, we get to talk about mental health basically in women. And very recently, I had a conversation about mental health in men. But I think the side that is often overlooked is children and how they deal with academic activities and all of that. So I'll start with you, Dr. Harris. Yeah. How do you integrate mental health into academic performance?
Yeah, and I always tell people...
maybe apologies. I think you should start by expressing what mental health is in your own words. Yes.
So there's a definition I like to use from the World Health Organization, and it says mental health is the way in which we're able to function in our everyday lives. So I think when you put it like that, it's really clear to see we all have mental health, right?
Absolutely.
We may be on different ends of the continuum. I say sometimes you may wake up, you're having a really good day. Sometimes you may be feeling a little low that day. Then there's sometimes when there's a diagnosis that should be involved, right? Because there may be some chronic depression. That's when you're feeling really sad, or chronic anxiety, like feeling really worried for a long amount of time. So I think that's really important to put in context. When it comes to kids, I always tell people kids are human and they have feelings and they will tell you what they feel. And so I look at it from not only just a mental health perspective, but also as a parent, and giving space for our children, to be able to say how they feel, to be able to express themselves, and normalizing that and saying, yes, I understand that you are angry right now or you are sad right now. And then having the resources like Dr. Crumb talked about in place in the schools and in other community organizations, so they have that support there. So they know they can have someone to go and talk to. Because if we don't teach them when they're young to express their feelings, then there's no way when they're older we can expect people to express their feelings. So we start when they're really, really young. And one of my favorite activities, there's this little chart that I have that has different faces up there. So maybe a sad face, happy face, surprise face. And I may ask the child to point to how you're feeling today. And they're able to point to the face that matches how they're feeling. And so some things like that kind of get the conversation going.
Oh my God, that's really interesting, because a situation where you can have a child, have those chats and be like, make a choice of how you feel today. It's really interesting. Now, Dr. Crumbs, there are situations where I think I've seen a case where I think I saw a movie, and then the girl literally told her dad, like, I'm depressed. And the father said, what is depressing you? Didn't you eat today? I gave you money for this, I gave you money for that. I'm like, no, Dad, it's beyond that, I'm depressed. And the father said, if you're in the village, would you be depressed? Like, it's because you're privileged, that's why you think you're depressed. So, which brings us to most of the times in rural settings, they feel like you do not have a right to your emotions, especially when it comes to children. You just have to stay fixed. So let's get your opinion on that, because you've had a lot of experience handling some of these rural cases, and of course, express what you think mental health is in the simplest of opinions too.
I love that story, because I also think that we gender things like boys shouldn't cry. Well, they have tear ducts. It is very natural for things. So to say because, they don't live it wherever they live, or their different financial circumstances, that they can't be sad and depressed, that is not true. We are humans. Exactly. Our privilege is being able to have emotions. And what Dr. Avent Harris said, the ability to express. Some people will have anger, and it can be fear. It can be a lot of other things, but they're mad. They're mad, especially a lot of kids, or they're mad. But what are you really? Are you disappointed? Are you not feeling heard? Are you scared? And so increasing our ability, our emotional vocabulary is something that is very important. Also, to normalize mental stress. I cannot say even more. When I get up on Monday, and I'm so very fortunate to have a job to get up to, sometimes my spirit is like, oh, I'm blue. Yeah. Sometimes
I
I'm
think
not.
It happens to me too.
Yeah.
I just feel like today I don't feel like doing anything. That song, I just want to stay alive in my bed.
Yes.
Just feel like, please, I just want to stay here today.
And it's okay.
It's
And it's okay. But I think when we start to talk about it, and on Sundays I'm joyous, so sometimes I'm like, oh, tomorrow. And then it's okay to say, today is a day. Today is a day. And give yourself the opportunity to have a bad day. When it starts to cross into the point of concern is how it impacts your functionality of the day, or if it goes a long term, like has this day turned into 7? Has this having this day turned into 14? Has this day turned into a month? Are you eating, or are you isolating? That's one end.
Oh yeah, that's true.
That's one end, but then the other end, are you irritable? Are you snappy? Are you starting to just ruminate over things? That's one end. That's when you sort of want to consult with a very trusted person to talk about it, because what I think is healthy is getting things out. We have got to move away. We have to move away from holding stuff in. We aren't made to hold stuff in. That's why there's so many people on earth. And that's why we're social beings. That's why we have language, and to express. Now, there are healthy ways to express. Maybe not on social media and putting all your information out to the world, but there are trusted individuals that if we are having those feelings of feeling down, or thoughts that we need to share, because maybe they're logical or maybe they are disturbing, but we have to share, and we have to be comfortable and encourage each other to share these things when we're down, or when we know that we're not at our best, or when something's feeling strange on the inside.
I like the points where she dropped it. Feel free to talk to someone. So that's why I'm coming to you, our angelic guest. So let's look at it from this angle.
Okay.
What's the role of spirituality here? You know, sometimes we have spiritual leaders, and some persons would want to consider, you know, bringing in their spiritual leaders. So what's the role of spirituality in this case, especially when it has to do with mental health in education?
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of things. There's some informal things and some formal things. So
Okay,
I think
please walk us through it.
informally, I think when people go to whatever their faith center is, it's a place where they can find refuge. It's a place they can release. To Loni's point, we aren't meant to hold stuff in. So I know, like, for me growing up and still now, my church is very expressive, right? So when I go in, I could just be me. I can release maybe all those emotions. So that's one part of it. And then I know a lot of people do seek counsel from their spiritual leaders. And so I always tell spiritual leaders, like, that's your role and that's great. And we want to work together. I don't want to be a preacher.
Exactly.
You know, I'm good. So I'm going to let you do your thing.
Okay.
But when you're holding space for people, remember to say and know your limits. So there are times when you may need to say to someone, hey, I can support you. I can be here as your spiritual leader, but you need to go see someone for some of these other concerns. I think in the messages they send, in maybe the sermons and things like that, making sure that they promote mental health and they don't exacerbate any stigma. I think that's very, very critical. And
Well, sorry to cut you, but you know that most of the time in the spiritual settings, there are usually like counseling units as well. Does that work?
say that part one more time.
Counseling units in most of the spiritual settings.
Yes, so
Okay.
that's actually one of the things that we promote
Okay.
is to have integrated approaches like that. So to have counseling ministries, to have a counselor there, because people still may be more comfortable going to seek some of those services from their spiritual community. And so I think that's really, really critical. And that's one of the things that we try to do even in rural areas. If there's a space in a faith center or a church or wherever where we can put a counselor, we can put an intern, that's actually really, really helpful. And it bridges those worlds together because we don't want them to be separate because that's just not realistic. And so it bridges those worlds.
You know, talking about setting up those counseling units, especially in rural areas, you know, most of the time I feel like they have limited access to information, healthcare, and all of that. So how do you begin to deal with things like this, especially when it comes to helping the children? Because first of all, they do not even look at it from the perspective of children need support when it comes to their mental health. I feel like a lot of parents will probably be wondering, what do they even need anything for? They feel like once we provided you everything you need, you're absolutely fine. And for privileged parents. But the underprivileged parents in underserved communities, they look at it like, it's just like the example you gave of your friend. The community didn't feel the need to support him. But in other communities, they would probably have supported him, help him speak out, even if not the entire community, but a couple of persons that are very vast and exposed would have been able to do better for him. So in this case, how do we begin to, you know, handle cases like this in rural communities, or how best do we get this enlightenment out to them?
As a counselor, I always start with the whole family. The whole family, because even when we leave that child at school, he goes back and then there's the family either to support. And so whenever I have a concern, actually, I think it's even stronger when I can involve the parents or the guardians first and not in a judgmental approach like this is wrong, to say, hey, come on in, come to the school, or can we even come to your home? Like, be a community. They have to see professionals as part of the community, because they want the best for their children. We hope they do, and we do too. So let's lower the guards down, right? Let's take those down, and then educating the parent on some things that we have concerns about. And then, like, in a non-judgmental way, allowing the parent to ask questions without feeling judged or you don't know this. We, the professionals, we always got to think about our approach, you know, as educators.
Very
Or whatever
important.
too. And then having a conversation I like to have a conversation with the child and the parent, then the child alone, because it may be something that they don't feel comfortable having a parent around. But I think some level of involvement of the caretaker and the child to increase education, to increase symptoms. And I love that because having children who won't sit down, hyperactive, a lot of people like to say they're bad or they're troublemakers. And I'm like, well,
bully them into
yeah,
silence.
but those are very negative connotations. And then the child starts to believe those things. So sometimes we'll get teachers in, we'll get parents in and say, hey, I think he's high energy or that's a high spirited child. And sometimes the child is so helpful to say, yeah, I just don't know what to do with all this energy. And when we see the counselors, they'll start to come and walk behind us because they know it's not these negative labels. It's just these other things. Or have you eaten? Or have you taken your medicine and eaten at the same time? You ask these other questions. One thing I did want to share too, a lot of times when we go into schools, before I can even get to the kids, it's usually the school leaders and the teachers who have their own mental health concerns too. That's how I know that there is a need for these conversations in rural areas. So when we go there to maybe work and see their children, a lot of the time I'm stopped in the office and they're talking about their own adult problems or adult stressors or loss of loved ones. And we definitely hear them out too. So it's a everybody approach, even to get to the kids. In order for our teachers and our school leaders to take care of the kids, they have to be well too. They need a space.
Absolutely.
Everybody needs a space.
Absolutely.
I was just going to add to that. So we had in our area some hurricanes that came back to back, and many people were displaced like within 2 years. Like they lost their homes twice. And so our first inclination was like, how do we get to the kids? Like, how do we support the kids? And I think when we started our project, it really very quickly we realized, well, there are teachers, there are principals, there are school leaders that are not living in their home, that lost everything. And so we were having to hold space for multiple people at the same time. And not to forget that the leaders, the school leaders, the teachers, they're humans too. They go through things. They have stressors. It's very stressful working in schools. I mean, you love it. We love it. But there are a lot of stressors associated. You're holding space for the kids, trying to make sure they're educated. Sometimes you may not have all the resources that you think you need to have or that you should have to do what you need to do. And so we always try to remind the teachers and the school leaders, like, take care of yourself. Like, you have to take care of yourself so you can be good to the students. But I just thought about that when you were saying.
You know, I was even going to ask you immediately after she dropped, because it's important that not just the students now, the teachers, because most of the time I feel like they even have the bigger problem. And if they don't have this culture of care, they may not know how to transfer it to the next person. For instance, if I do not love myself, I probably won't know how to love the next person. So which means that they probably we need to start with the teachers, caregivers. I remember there was a particular meeting I was, and there were kids in that meeting. And it's this conversation we're having now that made me remember, because you were talking about a situation they were talking to, saying a child is hyperactive, they're too loud, they're this. And a woman literally got up and was like, shut up, you talk too much. Like she literally shushed the boy, like, shut up, you talk too much. It was bad. And he, all through the meeting, so we ended the meeting, he couldn't say a word. This is not his mom. This is just somebody from a gathering that he was interested in and he came for. So you can imagine what that's going to do to the child. So how do we inculcate the culture of care, not just into just the educational system? Because I feel like this is beyond just the classroom. Like she said they go back home to the family, to everyone watching, because there could be caregivers amongst them, there could be guardians, parents, amongst people that are currently viewing us. So how do we inculcate the culture of care into our everyday life, that we begin to help our children, live better lives?
Well, what's coming up for me is this idea of self-awareness. And that means just being fully aware of where we are, what we are feeling. So when Dr. Crumb spoke earlier, she talked about sometimes irritability can be a sign of some depression or some anxiety. So I can always tell for my own self as a parent when my fuse is really, really short. Like when I'm really snappy with my kids or I have less patience, I try to check in and say, like, okay, what's going on for me today that I'm like, that my fuse is short or I have less patience. And most of the time, I'm feeling worried about something. I'm feeling anxious about something. So instead of putting that on them, I try to check in and say, okay, let me deep breathe. Let me do what I need to do. Let me think, let me pray, let me meditate, whatever that is, so I can calm myself down. I think that's that's one of the big things. And then empowering people with tools. So a lot of times we are quick to be snappy or to shut people down because we feel like we don't know what to do. And so to Dr. Crumb's point, like when we had those meetings with teachers or with families, or caregivers, community leaders, it's giving them simple steps to help support the kids in their lives. And so, okay, you have a hyperactive kid, let them play for 10 minutes and then say, okay, now we have to sit down and do this. Like give them space to get the energy out. Sometimes we give them these little toys to put in their hands so they can have something to play with, so they can get that energy out and refocus. And think about like the bigger picture, right? So you want the student to learn, you want the student to be healthy. Is it really bothering you that they may be moving around their seat? You know, is that really a thing that we have to go off about? So I think it's really empowering the adults to be aware of themselves, but just to think about, you know, how can I create a supportive environment?
I like that. So Dr. Crumbs, you know, I've been thinking about what she said, and I think we should look at it from the angle of how should parents as well, you know, handle situations like this, because most of the time students can come back home and tell their parents, oh, so this happened in school. Most of the time a lot of children want to talk to their parents. This was my experience in school today, but parents are just probably too busy. How should this be handled?
Well, Harris, I was talking about self-advocacy, teaching your child how to understand systems, how to understand reactions. You said you gave an example of like the teacher talking really down.
Yes.
Well, I would ask my son, I have 2 sons, well, how did that make you feel? Usually I'll say, what did you do first? What did you, let's be honest, what did you do? Like, okay, let me get some environmental context for how did that make you feel? Do you think that something should be said to the teacher? And usually not the child, because we, in our culture, the adult talks to the adult, you know, not the child talk to the adult and try to resolve it in that way. And then I'm big on advocacy, self-advocacy. So teaching my child, like, why do you think, so they can start to understand on our level. And do you think it was okay for her to talk that way? Now, if not, I think that parents definitely have to be involved. You know, a lot of times parents are intimidated to come to schools for some reason. They're very intimidated by teachers. But I'd say
totally wrong.
Yeah, which is definitely no. We both are invested in these children. So I think open conversations and asking questions and lowering defenses on both sides, the people in the schools or the teachers and the parents too, lowering those defenses too, because I think defense you can get both ways. But just talking openly about the concern and even involving the child in the concern too, which will also show them mediation skills. It will help to build their social and their relationship skills that will help them become healthy humans I think.
All right. Thank you very much. We've been having such an interesting conversation, but it's time to go on a very quick break. When we return, the conversation continues. All right, viewers, I'm sure you're enjoying the conversation, but let's quickly go on a quick break. When we return, the conversation continues. Come back. We're still discussing mental health and education with Dr. Harris and Dr. Crumbs in the studio, and I hope you've been enjoying the conversation. All right, before we went on that break, I know you were trying to express some things around some of the symptoms that people get to experience when it comes to mental health. So I want you to pinpoint a few of them, especially in children, that parents can discover and know that, no, my child needs that extra attention or my child needs counseling. So what are those few symptoms that you think?
So one of the first things that comes to mind is if there's a sudden change in presentation. So when Dr. Crumb was speaking of the example earlier, you know, if you have a kid who has traditionally been outgoing, outspoken, and they become more reserved or withdrawn, if they stop doing things that they once enjoyed, so let's just say they play a sport and they are not going to practice anymore, they're saying, oh, I don't want to play that. If you notice maybe a change in their academic performance, so maybe they were really high performing and they haven't been performing as well, not hanging around their friends as much, so being much more isolated. A lot of times we see drastic changes maybe in eating habits, maybe eating a lot less than normal or eating a lot more, and some accompanying weight changes. So those are all things that we look for to say like, something may be going on. Also, if one of the most, I think, misinterpreted symptoms a lot of times is that point of anger. So we may see a kid who, let's just say, gets into a fight, right? We see fights all the time. And it may be our first inclination to say, that's bad behavior. However, sometimes it's them trying to
There's a
express
trigger.
something that they don't have the words for. So I look at all those things. And so when we get discipline referrals and people say, oh, this kid got into a fight, I'm always like, tell me about your day, or tell me what's going on, so I can try to get some context for it. So those are just a few things that come to mind.
And on the other end of the spectrum, some more intense things that we see among youth are hyposexual behaviors and also self-harm. They're starting to harm themselves, which we know is definitely a red flag that leads to suicide. And we are definitely seeing an increase on child suicide across the world. Across the world, it is happening. And even unintentional suicide, when they're just playing around and they go too far, and next thing you know, they mixed too much stuff or they went too far, and then they have harmed themselves to end their lives. And all of these are concerns of youth. Some on a lighter side, but some on a more severe. But these are reports that we get all of the time.
You know, talking about some of these things, especially some of these self-inflicting that some children, you know, put on themselves, not just children now, youth as well. Is there a way, because I feel like sometimes it could be trauma based, and I know that you're an expert when it comes to handling trauma. I think I heard a girl's story. I always want to bring this in because I've had experience. Sometimes I try to read up about some cases, and sometimes when you see them on social media, you just know them to be true. So a particular case happened recently. A girl said she was abused at a very young age, and she started to, two siblings actually abused her. The first one started with her, the brother started with her, and then the sister found out and held her to ransom and said, you always have to do the same thing to me too. And then she started servicing brother and sister, and eventually she became addicted to it, that if they wouldn't come for her, she'll probably start find things to masturbate and all of that. And eventually she grew up and started using dogs to help herself because she couldn't get men to satisfy her enough. And eventually she granted an interview and spoke her truth, and afterwards she committed suicide. I feel like that's like, how do I explain it? That's boxing trauma.
Absolutely.
A very long time of trauma from when she was young. So she became older, like a full-grown woman committing suicide. She committed suicide 3 days after she granted the interview to speak her truth. Now, how do people handle trauma from the very beginning stage so it doesn't become something full-blown?
The very point of when you're talking about trauma is getting it out. Get it out. Because when we're in our own heads, we can convince ourselves of some of anything. And we go deeper and deeper and deeper. Who is there to talk us out?
Exactly.
We have got to get out of our heads. Now, it may not always start with the courage of sharing. A lot of people are expressive in drawing and writing. Okay, so there are other avenues, especially kids. Sometimes sometimes children don't have the words to say that this is happening to me a lot. So drawing, writing, and this is something that not only therapists, this is something that parents, anybody, any adult can say, hey, draw me something. So that's an inclination, even if she didn't have words to express. But getting it out, getting shared again. And this is why we always want to encourage sharing in some capacity, either verbal reporting or reporting to someone that you don't feel as intimidated by, like a bus driver, just anybody, an auntie.
Well, you know, sometimes just talking to a random person sometimes could even put you in harm's way.
But yeah, just sharing. And then I'm thinking that maybe if in this situation, if it would have been reported or shared earlier, there could have been maybe empowerment to do things about it, even her, or safety protocols in place, like how to stay away from said person. Like there are so many ways to address it, but it has to sort of be known first.
And if I could add, you talked earlier about where this like spirituality and religion comes.
Yes.
So one of the things that we look for when we are helping people post-trauma or even in diagnosing like mental health things is hope, right? Because hopelessness is one of our key indicators that someone is having some really severe mental health. And a lot of times people's hope and their ability to see life and purpose in life is connected to their spiritual beliefs. And so we can't leave the spirituality out of the conversation because it's like that's where a lot of people find their hope. And so it's inviting that conversation in, asking them like, what are you hopeful for? what do you think your purpose is? What do you think you have to live for? What do you have to contribute? And working with some of that and process some of that with people, I think has been really helpful too in navigating trauma.
Yeah, because I was even going to ask you, like, how do we bring in spirituality into some of these things? Let me share my experience.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes in 2018, I had a terrible experience. I boarded a vehicle, a one-chance vehicle. So I was literally held to ransom for over 2 hours. And since then, it's such a big deal that I can't even board public transport anymore. I can't travel in the night anymore. A lot of things I used to do that I enjoyed doing, I can't do them anymore because I'll feel like I can't trust the next person. Who's this next person? It wasn't because I didn't express it. I told everyone who was willing to listen that this was my experience, but it didn't make any difference for me. It didn't help me heal. So in this kind of situation, what should I have done? I'm saying this because I know quite a number of persons have had this experience. In fact, it's been on the rise in Nigeria lately that people get kidnapped, people board the wrong vehicles, people become victims of robbery. In fact, when we talk about that, we literally say in Africa or in the world. We have cases of robbery everywhere in the world. But what should someone like me do? So I'm going to take both your opinions. So I'll start with Dr. Harris.
I'll go to the trauma expert first.
Okay.
I'll defer.
Okay, so I'll take you, Dr.
Well, from a situation like that, you definitely going to see some PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndromes, or some post-traumatic stressors. The best thing that I heard you say is you not to let fear cripple you, because you still want to get out at some point, right? And it's going to have an effect usually right after the event, but you start working on that by awareness. Situational awareness is a good thing. Now you're more aware of the situations, who you're getting in the car with, what time it is, but and it may come up, it may get nervous, but it cannot cripple you to the point where you don't engage in these activities, or you do exactly what you do. You engage in them differently during the daytime with someone else, and you're way more conscious. That's still on the path to healing because it's not crippling. You did not avoid these. Now, the other flip side of that, there's been some people in your cases that do not take any transportation anymore.
Sure.
It can go totally on the other end, but working through trauma is having that awareness and going in, that self-awareness and situational awareness, and not being crippled with fear, because when we're crippled, that's not growth. Right? And then undoing some of the thinking. Sometimes with kids, we call it stinking thinking.
Okay.
With adults,
thinking.
Yeah, the
okay,
stinking thinking, right? With adults, it's illogical or irrational thoughts, right? That like, this is going to happen again. This person means me any harm. Is no, that situation calls you to feel this way. And that's when outside people help, when you have the therapist. But you can do some of this work on your own too, by just identifying this precipitating factors, what causes you to be anxious or fearful, and then say, is this realistic? Is it not? And if it is feeling real, what proper precautions can I put in place to help with this?
I think I like that. So I'm going to tell myself right now, do not let fear cripple you. So let's get your opinion.
Well, it's interesting. We were having a conversation just a few days ago, and so we are humans, even though we are counselors. We have our own emotions. We have all of that. And I was having some stuff, and Dr. Crumb said, I think you had mixed emotions, and you chose one to hold on to. And so sometimes that we have mixed emotions about a thing, and it's easy to just track with one emotion and we stick with that emotion. So I always try to encourage people to lean into the mixture of emotions. So there may be some fear there, right? But that might not be the only thing that you can feel or will feel, but it may be the thing that you've held on to. So kind of loose the grip of the fear a little bit. And then the other thing is with the spirituality part is, I always encourage people to have a few moments at the beginning of their day where they're just still and they meditate, and whatever that means for them, or having affirmations they can take with them throughout the day. And so for the example that you gave, maybe it's a couple times a day saying, I am safe. Like, I have what I need in this moment. I am safe in this moment. I have people who care about me. Just reassuring and reminding yourself of those things. But I also don't think, when we go through experiences, we learn through them. And so I don't think all of what maybe you have put in place is bad. So Dr. Crumb's point, like there are certain things that we say, oh, I don't want that experience again. So here are some different strategies I'm going to take.
I think I totally love that. And okay, let me then ask you both this question, but I'll start with you.
Okay.
So let's get your opinion. What are some of the barriers that you've experienced when it comes to mental health in education?
Yeah, so a number of them. But I think the biggest thing is just people not knowing and people not being able to recognize what is mental health. So I go back to like those symptomology. So in thinking about anger in children, or we talked about how people express themselves, like boys are often mislabeled as bad or devious or having conduct disorders because they aren't encouraged to express themselves with sad or feel vulnerable. And so that was one of the biggest, I think, Celia, sometimes one of the biggest barriers is normalizing that. And sometimes a barrier is there's just so much there. So I remember Dr. Crumb and I did a training for school counselors maybe a couple years ago now, and I'll never forget when the school counselor said, she was like, I can't even start my day because I'm helping a teacher try to get themselves together to get out of the car. And so this was kind of post-COVID, right after we were going back into schools, because we were shut down for a while, and so going back into those schools. And so it always reminded me of like just how much is there. And so sometimes we don't have all the supports that we would like to have. Even when you're thinking about rural schools, in our area, so we have like school districts, right? And so there may be one school counselor that covers most or sometimes all of that school district. So they're trying to attend to all these children at the same time, and that's just not feasible. So we always advocate for more resources in the schools, more school counselors in the school, for people to have training. And that's where those other community partners and stakeholders come in, because if you can have your teacher trained, you can have a school counselor there, your spiritual leader, your pastor, your priest, whoever that is trained and equipped, then you're surrounded by support. Like you feel empowered. You have this, I always say, like this circle of trust. And so those are some of the barriers that come to mind for me.
All right, so let's get your opinion, Dr. Crumb. Some of the barriers you find in mental health education.
Two things come to mind. One common one is this superhero syndrome. Like there's nothing wrong with me, and when other people are around, you can say, "Hey, there's something going on."
You have a problem.
But no, I don't have a problem. It's this. It's this projecting on the others. I think that if people, you need to listen to your environment sometimes, but our ego, sometimes will not let us be open when somebody tells you something.
We feel like it's a weakness to express it.
Absolutely. And actually we see this a lot of times in our teaching, in the professorate with our students who are in mental health, trying to become mental health counselors, and things come up for them. And as teachers, we say, hey, school is probably not what you should be focusing on, this personal stuff. And they say, no, I want to come to class. I want to do my work. So sometimes it's that superhero syndrome. Now, this is a big one that I absolutely think is a barrier. And I'm just going to take the conversation here. The willingness and openness to take medication for mental health, for mental illness is something that is...
Okay, so are you saying there are medications to be used?
Yes.
Oh, great.
Yes.
Like this conversation? Okay.
Yes, psychotropic medications, where to the point where this is when you have gone and you've talked to a professional about it, but there is something biologically that needs to be treated. So we see people take medicines for health issues, pain medicine, blood pressure, whatever that may be. But when it comes to something related to mental illness, there's a door shut immediately and saying that I'm not taking any medication for that. And so I think that is a barrier, because there are some situations that warrant additional treatment from those from psychiatrists is what we call them. But I definitely see that as a barrier, or they'll take it for a while to deal like more severe mental illnesses, and then they'll say, I'm fine and I don't want to do it anymore. I mean, if you still had pain, you would continue to take it until your pain goes away. And so that's a barrier that I see of mental health and mental health treatment overall.
Okay, so whilst you were talking, something came to mind, which is because we're looking at in education, which means that we'll probably be focusing on students. And I'm thinking, what about the kind of workload that these children in the university, high school, primary school, kindergarten, the kind of
Yes.
workloads that it gets to handle,
Yes.
isn't it enough to sort of affect them? Because somebody once said, at the end of the day, after graduation, you realize that you probably never even needed some of those things. But you had to deal with them.
Yeah.
And nobody cares.
Yeah.
And most of the times, you know, some lecturers are very far behind and they give you everything and they tell you. Because it may seem as though we're graded by results now.
Oh,
It's not about what you know. Sometimes your academics, your grades is what counts, is what matters. That's what the educational system is actually bringing to our doorstep and to our faces every day. So let's look at some of these workloads that they go through. Is it not enough to affect their mental health? Let's take you first.
It's funny you say that because we were just we just had a parent teacher conference for my little girl. She's in 2nd grade. And I was stressed by the amount of work that she was having to do. And I said, I cannot do this. I cannot do this. And so it was also teaching her, she got a bad grade and she was devastated. And so it was teaching her like to separate her own personal worth from what a grade is, right? That you are not that great on that test. Like you are a full human with gifts and talents and abilities. And hey, you may be having a hard time in math right now, but we're going to support you to get through it. And so it's separating that. I was a college counselor for a while, and so you see a lot of mental health stuff related to how students perform in college. So it was a lot of processing and thinking and helping them think like, okay, if you get a B, it does not mean you are a horrible person or that you have failed at life. It means you got a B on this particular exam. Like it's not the end of the world.
It's not.
So supporting people through that. But you're right. Like our society has trained us to think like, because even
It's your grade that defines you.
It's your grade that defines you, and it's not. And so being proud of your work, great thing, but not letting that define you, because then you could start to develop what we call some perfectionistic tendencies. And that's when you are solely driven by having to be perfect, everything having to be all the way together all the time. And that's just not realistic. Like, that's not a realistic way of being. And so it's going to be very disappointing for you to think that the world and you're going to be perfect.
You know, I want to get your opinion too, because it just occurred to me that it starts from childhood.
Yes.
Having people who grow up to have insecurities of their own failures because they feel like I am boxed to be perfect, you know. But let's get your opinion.
And I was going to give a flip side from being a college counselor. I remember there was a young lady in the College of Nursing. She had a really, really bad, a tough early life. And she came to the College of Education, and she found her footing. She was good at school. She loved it. And man, did that really help her trauma. You know, her housing insecurities, you know, I think she was even a migrant, right? And coming to the university, people believed in her. People told her that she could. Nobody in her life had ever told her that. She ended up graduating top of the class. And I remember she worked so hard. Then she had some type of medical issue, and she went to school. She went to the hospital doing her exams and did her exams and still passed. And I said, never in the history have I ever seen any nursing student pass their nursing exams, you know, that sick. And because it gave her drive. So I say that to say, no matter what your life experience is, a situation does not have to define you. Something that happens in early childhood, early life does not have to be your destiny at all. Like going to college or going somewhere, moving somewhere, you can find a brand new footing that can give you power to help you unlearn or undo and heal as well. Nothing is ever like deterministic and detrimental to your well-being.
Oh my God, I totally love this because it really got to me somehow, because I know I've got to meet a lot of persons, and most of the time some people feel like it's this grade. I know I met some persons that they really couldn't do so well academically, but they are very, very sound when it comes to, they can express themselves. But when it comes to the grades, you just don't see it manifesting. So I try to tell them, sometimes it's not just about this. Maybe you need a different approach to some of these things. Maybe you just need to adjust and you just need to see life from a different perspective. So I would love you to talk to those kind of people right now, especially because of your field. So I'd like you to talk to those people, because I know you have experience counseling most of these children, students, because I believe that it starts from somewhere and people grow up to become who they are.
So yeah, I definitely always try to remind people that all of us have something to contribute and we all have a purpose. And it looks different. And if all of it was the same, then the world wouldn't be as exciting, right? And so my strength may be, I may be really good academically in school, right? Well, that's great. But then we all like to enjoy entertainment and the arts. So we got to have some people who are good at dancing or good at theater. And so the diversity of gifts in us all makes our world what it is. And so really it's about finding who you are, finding your purpose. And that's why we try to encourage people, like, you got to stick around, right? You got to stick through it, because you have something that this world needs. You have something that your school needs, that your community needs, that your family needs. And you are a whole person yourself, even without having to give something. Like, your existence is a gift. And so that is so important to nurture in people, to cultivate in people, and to remind them. And I would just echo what Dr. Crumb said, like, one situation does not have to define you. And that as you navigate life, as you navigate challenges, you begin to learn more about yourself and you learn more about other things. And so it's also an opportunity, because I imagine that person will then be able to tell her story to someone else as an encouragement, right? And so we're able to empower others through that.
You know, because you said your community, you mentioned community, so that reminds me of a story I wrote sometimes back about a girl titled The Blood Girl. So what happened with the blood girl was, I think as a child, she didn't know about menstruation, and then she got stained at some point in school, and everybody labeled her, oh, the blood girl, and it became, oh, the blood girl. She had the title just stuck, and she would hide. She couldn't come out. It was traumatic, for her. She started hiding from place to place. She didn't want people seeing her. She would rather go out in the dark than going out during the day. So I'm looking at community impact. Are there co-collaborators in this that can help, when it comes to mental health education?
As far as in the community, I think so. I also believe in opening up the schools to the community, be to organizations. This whole project while we're here is part of Mabrin Foundations. We have a set of assets and the community have a set of assets, resources, constraints. So bringing in people from supporters, in the United States, we have fraternities, sororities, faith-based organizations, civic organizations. So when our ropes are tied and rules are there, or there's this situation that the school maybe have this public stigma or the kids are bullying, then there's this after-school program that's totally unrelated. And I think that's the power of what full service community schools or school community partnerships is, getting everybody a chance to relate to the child. Maybe it's the person in an after school counselor, a teacher that can say, hey, and help her undo those thoughts. So having different touch points and different people. And that's just so important to me, because maybe the school counselor or the teacher contributed to the negativity.
Exactly.
Then it needs to be somebody else. Like, it's not in that relationship, how they relate to that child, the child no longer trusts them. So give somebody else the opportunity as well. So that would be my approach to that.
Okay, so let's get the measuring. How do we measure the success? How do we know when we're doing the right thing with the children when it comes to mental health in the education sector?
I think there are different points, right? So the ultimate outcome for me is that a child is able to thrive and to make the best decisions for themselves, for their current and for their future, right? So when they're able to be successful in life. But I also look at what we would say like little small successes, right? So maybe it's that child in the class who had been really withdrawn, and you see them start to be more interactive. You see them starting to contribute more. For me, that's a success. Maybe it is a teacher who had been a little resistant to this idea about how we integrate mental health in our educational settings. And you see them start to have a feelings chart on the wall. Like, that's a success for me, I think personally, because of my my background, the biggest success I always see is when I see pastors really starting to be open about this conversation and promoting this conversation and supporting this conversation. Like, that makes me happier.
Because especially in churches, that's where it starts from. In fact, let me not just say churches. Let me just say in religious settings. That's where it starts from. That's where it may seem as though your faith covers everything. So you shouldn't talk about this. You shouldn't talk about that. In fact, in some religious homes, you dare not talk about mental health.
You're right. And so, but just understanding that we are human, and so we have human feelings, and that's okay, right? And so I am always excited and encouraged when those conversations are starting to happen, because a lot of our values and our belief systems are tied to our faith and tied to what we believe about our faith. And so I think that's success, that's progress. I think us being here is success, and it's progress, and it's showing that these conversations are starting to happen more and more. And so I tend to celebrate the big ones, but I also look for those little changes in our community. We talked about, we both come from rural communities, so when I see people, I run into people at the grocery store and they're like, "Oh, I got me a therapist now." I'm like, "Oh my God, that's good." And people being able to be more vocal about that, because I know I think about some people I went to school with, right? If they're getting therapy, that means that they're going to be healthier. That means they're going to be healthier for their children. Their children may have a better experience. So it's generational impacts. So I look at it like that as well. So we're making ripple effects that can kind of reach far.
I like that. So let's get your opinion on the measuring success thing.
So when I think about how I show up to others as a mental health professional, I think of some of everything. And right now, coming to me, I think about young women and building their resiliency, maybe having a child at an early age, unexpected. What does that mean? That does not mean you stop.
True.
That means that you take a minute, made life with the situation, then things are going to have to shift. But being success is them continuing school. Right? Them, finding somebody they can talk to their emotions about and how to plan forward. So when I think about that, is when I think about success or just being resilient, is not letting a situation define you, but moving forward with it. Yes, maybe you got pregnant, had a baby, but then you went ahead and you stuck through school or you went back. For the kids who don't go to school or find interest in low motivation, getting back into school and finishing, having a product to show, I think is a test of resilience. So building resilience. Also, I think that building resourcefulness, meaning that particularly when we're talking about low income, people in poverty, is I may not have it. So what do? Are you sad? Do you look at yourself as less than? I would rather for a person to say, how can I get it? Rather than we don't have access to. How can I create access? How can I get? We've got to flip that thinking into doing, into action, or we'll just be like swimming in our woes, right? Like we're always going to have challenges. I mean, they're going to be whatever they may be differently, but how can I? How can I find resource? How can I network? And also, what can you do on the behalf of your community? If you're in an impoverished community that is food insecure, how can you, and if you have the internet and you have connections, then how can you bring a program to your community to help address that?
All right. So in rounding up, because I wanted to ask you further questions, but my producer just signaled me like it's time to leave the studio. But in rounding up, let's get your final thoughts to our viewers this morning. Dr. Harris, let's go with you first.
So I would just say my final thoughts are to embrace your humanity, to seek out resources, and to find your support systems. To know that we are all human, so we may have days when we feel sad, we may have days when we feel happy, elated, excited, whatever it may be, but to embrace that humanity, to get your resources, and to lean into your support systems.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Crumb, let's get your
my
opinion.
final words would be mental health is wealth. When you feel good, you do good. And nobody can create that for you. You have got to do it in yourself. So feel empowered to ask for whatever you need and to do whatever you need to be safe and whole, because it's just as important as your physical health. And if you're not feeling good on the inside, you're not going to be fully driven to do the physical parts of what that's necessary for daily living. So mental health is wealth, and mental health is so very important for us all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Janeé Harris.
you.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Loni Crumb, thank you so
you.
much for your time today.
Thank you.
All right, viewers, I feel so energized. I feel so happy. Like, I've learned a lot this morning, and I hope you've done the same. I hope you've picked a thing or two. Thank you so much for joining the show today. I am Olamide Alhassan, and I'll see you again next week. Bye.